What is Final Fantasy is a question that quite honestly is the most smartest but dumbest question in the entirety of the gaming franchise, let alone in the context of this fabulous JRPG experience. Sheesh. So now the history of this beloved franchise, of course to start us off there, is with the mind of Hironobu Sakaguchi, where in December of 1987, he kinda gave us one of the most incredible experiences of all time, Final Fantasy on the Nintendo Entertainment System. A turn-based RPG that brought themes of good versus evil, of light versus darkness, and of course Warriors of Legends. This game sparked the inception of the turn-based RPG genre, alongside Dragon Quest earlier on. And with almost 60 numbered entries with various spin-offs later, we are now in its 35th anniversary, people, and again we're asking one of the most stupidest questions on the market, but it does have some reasonable justification. You know, while I personally find this question to be something that feels like a contrarian viewpoint in terms of review bombing the latest entry to the franchise, Final Fantasy 16, where goddamn people be thirsting for Jill's thighs and Clive's chest. That's how far we've come as a society, people, but it actually has some merit the more you look back at other entries that have done similar but different things in its execution. We're talking about the context of the question here, not so much the thirst traps that have sparked the Final Fantasy entry as of recent. So to start us off with this question, we obviously need to look at the current entry, Final Fantasy 16, as again, that game, oh man, it's quite a game, that's for sure. With a more linear exploration and a combat system that is based heavily from the Devil May Cry games, this numbered entry does feel like something that is like the black sheep of the franchise, but in a good way and not in a Final Fantasy 15 kind of way, which we'll get to that one in a second. And because of that, the reviews for this game kind of felt a little mixed, not in the sense of calling this game bad or anything, but just calling this game not a Final Fantasy game, which again sparked the whole conversation of explaining Final Fantasy to begin with here, people. Despite that though, it is understandable that people would wonder if this was a Final Fantasy game given its ARPG-like structure and action, and the same was met with many other games like Final Fantasy 15 with its open world ARPG structure, and even as far back as the Xbox 360 and PS3 games with Final Fantasy Type 0, where I wish people talked more about this one because this game was a field trip, let me tell you. And even to go further back with 1997's Final Fantasy VII for the PS1, this game was for a time argued as a Final Fantasy title given how dramatically different it was from a presentation standpoint compared to the NES and SNES titles, and even some of the more magic themed based games later on like Final Fantasy X and 12. This game changed the course of the franchise from a medieval style game to that of a steampunk and modern fantasy, where we now have a protagonist riding a motorcycle and a train instead of a dragon, which is kinda neat, I gotta be honest. And because of this is where again the basis of what is Final Fantasy starts to shine the most, as despite the similar structure in exploring an overworld, having an engaging story with interesting characters, and a turn-based game that utilized real-time strategy, it didn't have that essence of a Final Fantasy game, and others had that similar distaste too. Final Fantasy VIII got some flack for that in its presentation and taking similar direction in its characterization and aesthetics. Squall is a great character and certainly iconic, but it didn't feel as Final Fantasy enough regarding the identity of its character, similar to Cloud Strife in Final Fantasy VII. The entire 13 trilogy on the Xbox 360 was also notorious for being completely different and something that didn't downright felt Final Fantasy for many, on top of its own issues, even though I believe that games are actually really good for their time, and it was a wonderful set of casts. Lightning will always be my queen, that's all I'm gonna say here. And Final Fantasy 15, man, this game was trying too hard to be part of the team for sure, but clearly it stood out in the worst ways possible. While the open world was enjoyable enough, it was riddled with issues of story progression and content that it nearly took 6 DLCs and a definitive edition a year later to fix all that. Like, dude, why wasn't this game delayed any more than it already was? But then now, with this added context into the play here, well, let's actually answer that question of what is Final Fantasy, because in reality, Final Fantasy is a JRPG franchise, nothing more and nothing less. Now that may sound a bit confusing, I totally get it, but what I mean to say is that Final Fantasy does whatever it wants and wants to present an RPG experience that is unique and iconic for each entry, making them feel not just as different continuities that you can pick up and not having to play the other games for catch up on lore, but also in its gameplay structure, giving players unique experiences from point A to point B. These games were made to be inconsistently consistent, if that makes any sense at all, and by seeing how the shift in focus in one game's design is to another is what makes Final Fantasy so beloved as a franchise, because regardless of it being turn-based or not, you still have the Moogles, you got the Cactuars, the Chocobos as part of the charm, you got the classic good versus evil tropes and killing a god as a final boss by the end of it, you got the engaging plot and characters to boot, the magic system and summons, the RPG gameplay system as a whole, and it's just great times to be had regardless of which entry you started your journey with. And because of that, this question is really one based on preference rather than a question based on substance. And I think that's the real reason people are asking this question nowadays, because again, Final Fantasy 16 is leading the charge here despite being a really great game and experience. But of course, with that question now answered somewhat, I know some people have a different answer to that question, so I guess comment down below your thoughts on what is a Final Fantasy to you, because again, I love reading your comments and engaging with you guys here when it comes to these videos, and sometimes you enhance the viewing by just adding your opinion into the mix. Of course, just be respectful about it, because like many passionate communities out there, Final Fantasy is also one of them. I mean, they still haven't given up with the whole who's the better waifu for Cloud, Tifa or Aerith, and I think that's enough of a context to give you an idea of what I mean here. But so yeah, that's all I gotta say here. So, you know, just enjoy the video, do what you gotta do. I'll see you with more soon, and you know, just have fun with this one. Peace out, I guess, or I don't know how to end this one.